have 4 panelists who will be able to give you insights into the kinds of work and skills necessary for careers in academia or industry. The format will be like this. Each of the panelists would spend about 10 minutes giving you an overview of the work that they have done in both areas. And after all 4 of them have finished introducing themselves, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. Our first speaker, right, is Dr. Mary Gray, who is currently a senior researcher at Microsoft Research New England and an associate professor at Indiana University in communication and culture. Our second speaker will be Professor Caroline Ross, who is currently associate head of the Department of Material Science and Engineering at MIT. Our third panelist is Professor Robert Langer, who is currently institute professor at MIT. He's known for his pioneering work in biotech and contributions to medicine. So our last panelist is Mr. Christopher Noble, who is currently a technology licensing officer at MIT, and his expertise in university IP management and consultancy. Now, before I begin this panel, I want to thank our sponsors. We've currently worked with GCD, Global Education, Career Education, and Development. Jake, would you like to stand up so everybody can recognize you? And our other sponsors are also ODGE, who will be recording this event, but they will only be recording the 4 panelists. They will not be recording the audience. And the last one is the Office of the Vice President for Research. So thank you very much. And so just a quick question. How many of you are grad students? Could you raise your hands? Can I assume the rest are postdocs? Could you put up your hands too? Thank you so much. So I'm not going to begin the panel now. Professor Gray, thank you.
Hi. Thank you for the invitation, Emily, and I'm really happy to hear that you're having this conversation. I can honestly say in graduate school, I never once heard any other career path mentioned other than an academic post. And it was ironic because the program that I went to, University of California, San Diego, had a very quirky communication department. I was coming from anthropology, and the communication department was made up of people who had left industry or other walks of life because they had some sort of pressing question, and they felt that graduate school was the place to at least begin to pick away at that question. So strangely enough, most of my cohort imagined that when we came in, we would be going back out and contributing beyond academe, but many of us, and I don't know if this is true today, but many of us, after the first couple of years, had our sights narrowed quite a bit. So I feel like it's really important to talk about widening open that scope. What I'd like to do with the 10 minutes I have is tell you a little bit about my trajectory and give you a sense of where I'm at now and why I think it makes a case for the value of imagining a career path that mixes academe and industry or other settings. So I started out in anthropology both as an undergraduate and eventually as a graduate, but in many ways I was using the social sciences as a way of asking political questions. I started out as a youth organizer, very interested in grassroots organizing, particularly around sexuality and gender, and met a lot of other political activists, youth activists, who also felt that we needed a broader understanding of the cultural and social dynamics of organizing, social movement theory, social theory more broadly. And around the time that I was aging out as a youth activist, I fell into a .com during this was the early 2000s, late 90s, and that seemed to be the way to revolutionize the world. The internet was going to change everything. And after about 2 years there and the placing of someone from Unilever, I will never forget, in our company, I realized that a corporate setting wasn't necessarily going to be a good fit for me, and it wasn't answering the questions I had as as an activist. So I went to graduate school. I found, as I said, this quirky communication department. And I was specifically interested in questions about the social implications and the experiences of using technology in everyday life, particularly among people who have limited access to it. And that brought me to a focus on the rural United States. I was looking at young people who were coming out online and had no other place in their small hometowns in rural Kentucky, Tennessee, and other parts of Southeast Appalachia to turn to for resources. And it really allowed me to interrogate this question of both the promise and the limits of technology for creating change, for political organizing. It literally was not until my 4th year as a graduate student and I landed some funding, because I don't know how many of you are in the humanities, social sciences. There's not a lot of funding for graduate training beyond teaching. But that year, while I was doing my field work, I landed a pretty decent fellowship. It was almost $30,000, which was more money than I'd ever imagined I would ever have at one time. And I spread it out over 2 years. And it was about then that I thought, wow, I could actually have a full-time job doing research. So strangely enough, and I'm saying this because I don't know how many of you had this experience, strangely enough, it didn't occur to me that this was a job. I really thought this was just something you did because you couldn't help yourself and there was nothing else you could imagine doing. And it was around that time that I started asking my advisors, so what does it take to actually have an academic job? I come from a family that doesn't really, college is not the usual route, so some of my challenges in being able to see it as a job had to do with that. But I think it's also, as much as there's a conversation buzzing around academe being the career path you're supposed to take as a graduate student, there's not a lot of conversation about what does that look like as a career? How do you land yourself in that direction? So as I started asking people questions, the timing was a little bit off because I was finishing my dissertation and I landed a post at Indiana University, which is my current institution. I literally finished my dissertation and 2 weeks later started my position as an assistant professor there and rose through the ranks. Again, it wasn't really until my 2nd year that I started questioning, is this what I want to do with my life? Because an academic career is not just the research. It's finding funding for the research, it's finding time for the research, but it's also teaching and service. And so in many ways, the place I want to take us is to really think about what is it that you love about this environment. If what you love is being in a world where people are constantly asking questions and that you have something to contribute to that conversation, I promise you there are many paths to that experience. Academia is one of many places where you can do that, including in your off day, in your off time when you get out of work for a job that's paying the bills. So make sure as you're thinking about what career path that you would like, that you're thinking about what is it about this place that really excites you. If it's interacting with students and being able to share the conversation of, say, what you've read, that might mean that you're more geared and really well-suited to a teaching path. And again, there are many places where you can teach. And I think one of the greatest problems we have right now in academia is that we've sold ourselves on the story that you really have to have a very clear balance or a mix of all those talents of teaching, service, and research. That's a really tough set of skills to have in your own toolkit. In many cases, we almost always excel at one of those and make our way to finding some balance with the other two. So that 2nd or 3rd year when I started questioning, is this what I want to do with my life? It had everything to do with how much time it took me to really be able to accomplish the research that I needed to do. And in my field, that means publishing a book. And by your 3rd year, you have to have a pretty good sense of what is going to be involved in getting tenure at the institution you're at. But it was also the time I was discovering how much I loved teaching. To this day, I'd say the thing that excites me most is watching that moment when I'm working with students in a classroom and you can see them pick up an idea and twist it a particular way, and all of a sudden things are just flashing for them. That is a very exciting moment for me. That kind of teaching in a formal setting, again, is not limited to a classroom. And I think, if I had perhaps had my wits about me, I would have realized that I had so much more I could do with the training that I had through my PhD. So after getting tenure at Indiana and really establishing myself as a scholar, I had a really unique opportunity. I was asked to join Microsoft Research, which is based here in Cambridge. Microsoft has several different labs around the world. It's pretty unique as industry labs go because it really allows us to do basic research. I'm not told what I have to work on. I'm not expected to connect with product groups. That said, industry is going to increasingly need, and I'm saying this particularly to the social scientists in the room, but to all of you, technologies, media companies are increasingly going to need to answer the question, what exactly is the social role that technologies and media play today? There's no way that we can look at anything around computing today and not see it as fundamentally a social technology. It connects people. It doesn't just connect individuals to individuals, it literally binds us socially. So for folks who are wondering, would you have a place as, say, an ethnographer, as an anthropologist in a technology setting, I can promise you, industries are realizing the thing that they haven't been doing all along is asking, well, what do people actually do with this? What do they find valuable about these technologies? So that created this opportunity for me at Microsoft Research precisely because it was a place that wanted to ask these questions. That said, I'd still say, and it's probably telling, I haven't left my post at Indiana. I still maintain my position there. I believe that the future for many of us in the room is creating bridges between industry and academe. Academic conversations can't really detach themselves if they're in media and technologies without connecting to industry for the very basic fact that much of the data that we want to study is generated within these companies and through these companies' holdings. So that reality alone means that our fates are tied. But I think particularly for industry, it knows that in order to keep asking blue sky questions, to keep wondering what else can we do, that we really have to be able to think past selling something and being able to create space for the opportunity to ask basic questions, to generate new theories, generate new questions for us to tackle. It's going to require the kind of environment that an academic environment affords. I don't think either industry or academe can really do without each other. And the reality is that we're at I think, a crossroads of thinking about how to support each other more explicitly and formally, as opposed to imagining that we're able to exist in silos. With all of that said, I would still contend industry, academe are still not the only paths that are appropriate for anyone who has a PhD. The things that you learn as a PhD student have everything to do with discipline, insight, creativity, and a willingness to listen to someone else's ideas. Those can carry you to so many different places. And that's not to discourage any of you from an academic career or from a career in industry. It's to say, imagine that your skills are so much larger than either of those containers. They can't possibly take advantage of all that you have to offer. So whenever you start feeling like, what else would I do with these skills? Ask yourself, what do you want to do with them? What do you want to change in this world? Because as a PhD student, you've been trained and in many ways likely came into a program with the capacity to do so much more. And to contain yourself to those two locations, I think, is selling the world short. So with that, let me pass it to my colleagues.
Well, I'm Caroline Ross. I have a very different career path. It's very interesting to hear about yours. So I'm a materials scientist. I did PhD in materials science in England, in Cambridge, and I came to Harvard as a postdoc. And so the decision point was what to do after that. I'd done 2 years of postdoc. I'd worked on thin films. I'd done a little bit of many different topics, all the way from film deposition and patterning and characterization. I'd done some magnetism, I'd done some electronic properties. So I was a bit of a generalist in terms of thin film science, but it was really definitely a physical science. I was growing metals and oxides. So what could I do with that? And as a postdoc in Harvard, I was very naive about what the choices might be, and the same experience as you. There weren't any panels advising us what to do. The reason I went into industry was because I thought it would be fun to go to California, and probably some of you would feel the same way. So I thought, Silicon Valley, that sounds good. I'll go work in Silicon Valley. And I went to Silicon Valley for what turned out to be 6 years. So the job I had was working for a hard disk company. So we all have hard disks. You know what they are. There's a platter. It's got magnetic layers on. You store data on that. It's in a box. You don't really see anything other than what's on your screen about how this device is behaving. And I worked for a company which made just the disks, so not even the box or the rest of the paraphernalia that comes with it. We just made the disks. So I was working on hard disk thin film deposition and characterization. So I really had no idea what I would be doing when I got there. And like I said, I went there because I wanted to go to California. I asked my PhD advisor, what should I do? He gave me a list of old boys from his group and said, why don't you write to these people? And so I wrote to those people, and one of them I wrote to who'd been in one company, wasn't even there anymore, but he'd moved to this other company, which is the one I ended up working for. So it's a completely random occurrence. And I think if I'd been rational about the idea of keeping my options open and choosing whether to join a company that would eventually give me an in back into academia, this probably wouldn't have been the place I'd go to because nobody had ever heard of it. I had a job offer from Xerox or Hewlett-Packard. I could have gone to one of those, or even IBM, but I chose to go to this company because it seemed like an interesting choice at the time. So the company, Comag, made these hard disks, and I was a researcher. So my job was R&D, and it was mostly D, that's development, not research. So the kind of things we all think about in academic research is we're curiosity-driven. We want to understand the physics behind something, or we want to be able to engineer a material that will allow us to make some new gadget. So doing research here in data storage, I'm interested in things like how can I improve the magnetic material in order to give it certain properties that will make it better at doing whatever I want it to do. But that's not necessarily what you want to do in industry, and particularly in a relatively small company where I was, which didn't really have a long-term research program. We were doing things which are more like product development and firefighting. So the firefighting aspect of it is there's a problem in production. Let's send in all the nerdy people and try and figure out what's going on. So, for example, the first thing I did when I got there was, you imagine these disks, they have to be pretty flat. Well, they were making disks, and they had this curve in them. They were bowl-shaped. You couldn't really see it, but they were actually bowl-shaped, which is bad news in this hard drive. It makes it hard for the head to track it. So I had to figure out why these disks were bending, and it was all to do with the fact that the films that were grown on the two sides of the disk were different, and therefore one had more stress than the other, and the whole thing bent. So that was the kind of problem I was doing, and once I had figured out what the problem was and come up with a solution, that was the end of the story. There wasn't a paper to write at the end of it. There wasn't a conference presentation. In fact, that would have been exposing our weaknesses to the other companies. So one of the big differences is that we're not in a company driven by curiosity and the urge to publish our work and talk about it. We're driven more by solving problems, developing the next generation of products, and writing patents instead of papers. So I wrote a lot of patents, I didn't write a whole lot of papers. So what happens after that? I did this for 6 years. I had a great time. Living in California, I think, is as close to paradise as I'll ever get, especially in the winter, the last winter. So I often regret leaving, but there you go. I decided after a while that I'd got as far as I was going to get in this company, which was called Comag, by the way. It's now been bought by Western Digital. So some of you guys have heard of Western Digital. You may have a disk drive from them, but they bought Comag, which was not my company, but the company I worked for. So I was actually interested in academic research, and it became clearer as I worked on this industrial research that there's a lot of satisfaction in both kinds of life. I really enjoyed solving problems in industry. I enjoyed being the one who fixed something, coming up with a new way of, or modified way of growing the materials that we could get better properties. I had a pilot line, I had technicians. I didn't have to tinker with things too much myself, but I could still get things done. And then I really liked doing academic work, and so the question is, what to do then? To stick with the company or another company, or to get an academic job? And I actually had a couple of interviews, although the interview here was because someone from our department called me up and said, we're trying to hire faculty, do you want to apply? I didn't even think about applying to MIT because I was living in paradise. Why would I leave it? Anyway, so I did, and after a while I came back here. But the big difference, I think, is in the style of research, the motivation of what you're doing. And so when you do take an academic job or an industrial job, they are looking at the world through very different lenses. However, there is plenty of opportunity to cross between both. And I always advise my students to try out an industrial job, see what it's like, because you really have no idea. You spend your whole life in school and then do a PhD. Even if you do an internship, it doesn't really give you much of a flavor of what industrial research is like. So I think it's a very good idea to try it out. And the question is, if you decide you want to switch back and forth between academia and industry, what's your best strategy for doing so? And I found, because at the company I enjoyed doing research, I met up, I had a collaborator in Stanford and we wrote some papers together. I would make materials in my deposition systems after hours, and I'd work on them in Stanford after hours, and we'd publish papers about it. I would always try to publish stuff, even if it meant waiting for a couple of years until it was no longer sensitive, or until a patent had already been filed, and then it's okay to publish it. So I did quite a lot of work. I did networking. I was active in our professional society, which is the Materials Research Society. So I kept my options open, and then when there was a chance to get an academic job, I was able to take it, and my resume wasn't that bad. So that's how things worked out for me. So what should one do when you're thinking about which path to take? I know a lot of people really only contemplate academic work because you've been in universities and schools for so long, it's hard to imagine life outside. But life outside is very good, and there are many options. It pays better for a start, I should say. Industrial work does pay a lot better. And you get stock options, if you're lucky. You can do, also there are other options. You can do research in national labs. You could do research in large companies with a big research group that's almost like a university, like IBM, for example, although those examples are getting rarer. Or you can work in a very small, focused company like I was in, or even in a startup where really anything goes. So there's not a monolithic description of industrial research, just like there isn't a monolithic description of academia, because in academia you could be in a teaching position, you could be in a place like this where research is really the big thing and we teach and we enjoy it and we're passionate about it, but we won't get tenure if we don't do good research. So there's a whole spectrum of academic work, just like there is of industrial work and national lab work and things of that kind. So I would encourage you to think of it as a really broad spectrum and not be afraid to try things out, because it's easier and easier, in my view, to swap between them. I would say in the past, if you'd gone into industry, it was really a one-way street. You weren't coming back to a faculty position, but now it's actually quite common. So I think you have a lot more options now, and I would advise you to talk to people who've done both or who've done one or the other and really get a sense of what your personality is, what would fit in best with where you want to go, and then don't be afraid to try something out now, because you don't want to be trying out things when you have a mortgage and 6 kids to look after. You want to be doing it now when you have a little bit more freedom to get up and go to paradise or wherever you want to go. So I will stop there.
So I'm Bob Langer, and I'm a professor here. Some of what I want to say will mirror what you've heard, but I thought I would just start and tell you how I started thinking about things when I was a graduate student, postdoc, and even today. So I was a graduate student here in the 70s. And in the 70s, and I was in chemical engineering, like I said, in the 70s, there was kind of like this gas shortage like there was a few years ago, so the prices of oil gas kept going up and up at the gas stations. It was actually even worse then. If you had a car in the 1970s, you actually had to wait in line at the gas station for about 2 hours. So it was, but the good thing about that is that if you were a chemical engineer, you got a lot of job offers. And so every one of my classmates pretty much in 1974, they worked with an oil company. And actually all these companies would come to MIT. I don't know if they still do today, but they'd come and they'd interview you and then invite you to, their company, and you go and, in fact, it's funny, I was 20, to give you an idea of what a sheltered life I had, I was 24 years old. I'd never been east of Boston or west of Buffalo, and I got to see the country for the first time in my life on job interviews. But at any rate, and I actually got 20 job offers from oil companies. And it's not like I was that good or anything. They just had so many openings. I actually got 4 from Exxon alone. But, it's interesting. And I always tell people this, I think that, and I tell my students this, the interviews were incredibly helpful for me, because really what they showed me is what I didn't want to do. And I still remember to this day, I had one of these interviews at Exxon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And when I was there, one of the older engineers said to me, if you could just increase the yield of this one chemical by 0.1%, he said, that would be wonderful. He said, that's worth billions of dollars. And I still remember flying back to Boston that night thinking that I really didn't want to do that. I just wasn't excited about, you live once. I wanted to make some kind of impact. I didn't know what it would be, but I wanted to do something that I felt was important, and I didn't think it was that. So it made me really reflect on what I did want to do, what I would dream about. And one of the things that I did when I was a graduate student is and when I was supposed to be doing my thesis, is I helped start this school for poor children, a high school in Cambridge called the Group School. And I got very involved in creating new chemistry curricula. And I was very excited about that. And one day I saw an ad in a journal where you could apply to be assistant professor to do just that at City College of New York. So I wrote them a letter applying for a job, but they actually didn't write me back. But I liked the idea, so I found all the ads I could like that. And I wrote about 40 different colleges, and they weren't great colleges, applying to be assistant professor to create new chemistry curricula. And actually none of them wrote me back. So I guess I wasn't in the right box, I wasn't in the chemistry education box, even though I went to MIT. So that wasn't working so well. So I started to think, what other ways might I help people using my chemical engineering background? And I thought about medicine. So I wrote to a lot of hospitals and medical schools, and they actually didn't write me back either. But one day, one of the people in the lab where I was said to me, he said, Bob, there's a surgeon in Boston named Judah Folkman, and he said, sometimes he hires unusual people. And he said, you should write him. And actually, he offered me a job, and the job had nothing to do with anything I really knew. It was actually a new way to think about treating cancer. And I took that job, and that job changed my life. It was very difficult for me. It was, by the way, it was the lowest paying job by far, and it was kind of like a research associate at Boston Children's Hospital. But it was very exciting to me because it opened my eyes. I was actually the only engineer in the entire hospital, and I got to see things, that I probably would never have seen otherwise, and it gave me ideas because I knew something about chemical engineering, and I had ideas of how I could apply that to medicine once I saw these things. So anyhow, I worked there for several years, and actually at the end of it, one of my friends said, Bob, he said, you probably shouldn't work here forever. You should apply for a job that, is... So I started applying for faculty positions. And I applied for chemical engineering faculty positions because that's what I was. And actually none of them would hire me again. They said, all these things that you're doing, it's like this bio stuff, it's got nothing to do with chemical engineering. We want to do mathematical modeling and stuff like that, and you're not doing it. So I didn't get any jobs in the chemical engineering department. I ended up, Dr. Folkman actually knew Nevin Scrimshaw, who was actually at MIT in the nutrition department, talked to him, and he offered me a job. But actually, I won't even go into all the stuff that happened when I came to MIT. I mean, they wanted to get rid of me and fire me and everything else. But at any rate, but eventually they didn't. That's why I'm still here. But I do want to sort of go over what happened maybe, and eventually our research started going okay. But then one of the things that happened to me as I was doing this research, for about 10 years, and I'd be publishing papers, and I was very excited about the research that I was doing, but I think I was the only one that was. So, and I remember what I did, I applied for patents, and I actually got some patents, and but nobody seemed to be interested in them either. But then after about 10 years, I did get a call from a couple companies, and they asked me to be a consultant. And they were really big companies like Eli Lilly, and there was this also animal health company, International Minerals and Chemicals. And they said they wanted me to be a consultant. I thought that was a good thing. They also gave me a research grant. And they licensed the patents, and I was very excited about that. I thought now all the stuff I was doing, it was going to get used. But those large companies, they do 1 or 2 experiments a year, and when they didn't work, they gave up. And so even though I got some lab money and some consulting money, it didn't go anywhere. So, a couple of years later, one of my friends, Alex Klebanoff, is in the chemistry department now, said, Bob, he said, we should start a company of our own. And I'd always sort of been against that, probably just because I didn't know enough about it, but when he said that, we did it, and actually it ended up doing very well, and it developed a lot of these products, and so I kept doing it. So actually, we've probably, from our lab, we've probably gotten over 300 licenses or sub-licenses. I think we've started, me and my students, about 32 companies, and some of them have gotten to be pretty big. And I've really enjoyed that whole process about, trying to create a new company. Again, if you're a professor, you're not there full time. You come up with maybe some of the ideas, you hire some of the people, you help on the money. Every time I've done it, pretty much I've done it with my students or postdocs, and they're still at those companies today. So in a way, I've sort of come back full circle to the industry thing, but I love being at MIT and being a professor. I love working with the students, coming up with the ideas. I've also loved working at the company, working and getting those companies started. So anyhow, coming back to what do I tell people? I mean, my feeling is, my advice is to follow your passion. Sometimes people do things for money. Sometimes people do. I'm basing this on what my students who've come in over the years have told me. I've had students come in and say, well, I have to major in this because my parents told me, or I have to major in this because I need to make a good living. I guess my advice is, I tell people, do whatever you do. If you have a passion, if you have a dream, you want to be smart about it, but I personally feel to try to follow it. And that dream could be working in a company, it could be being a professor, it could be some combination, it could be something totally different. I hope when I think about these dreams, though, it's like I always think when people ask me, my guiding principle has always been on those dreams, how can I, with whatever skill sets I've had, good or bad, make an impact on the world, make it a better place, because that just makes me happy. And so I always tell people, it's kind of the simple message. about following your dreams. So it could be anything, but that's how I think about it. So thanks, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you to the organizers. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. It's great to see a lot of people in the audience. And this is a very interesting topic for me. I have to admit I'm the black sheep in this illustrious group of people because not only do I not have a graduate degree, I have an undergraduate degree in engineering, but even worse than that, I have an MBA. So it's like way over on the other side. However, I've had 3 careers, and all of them involved working really closely with both academics and sort of academic refugees that had gone over to industry. So maybe I can reflect a bit on my personal experiences of working with academics and academics in industry. I worked for big companies, you know, the multinational companies for a while, and then I worked in the startup world and the VC finance world. And now I work at MIT, and I license MIT's technology. I work in the technology licensing office. And I loved everything I've done, but this is by far the best job I've ever had because I spent all my time with really passionate MIT researchers trying to help them figure out what to do with their inventions and matchmaking with you know, companies big and small and with investors. And so working with passionate academics is a real privilege for me. And I've worked with them in lots of these circumstances. I'll maybe make a few observations, okay, for the first time instead of talking about my own experience, what I've observed among academics that's relevant to the topic at hand. And some of it reflects a little bit of what all 3 previous speakers' excellent remarks. It's really tough going forth after 3 really experienced speakers too. Anyway, so number 1, you really can't predict the future of your own interests. And I'd like to reflect and support what Bob said. Follow your passion. The challenge is you don't really know what your passion is going to be 20 years from now. And I think you shouldn't worry too much about what your passion is going to be 20 years from now. There are such a multitude of possible paths that you can take. There's a lot more opportunities now to create a rather different path than even your own role models. You know, you can pick and choose from your role models and create your own path. Number 2, I think that, and I'll take an analogy from aquatic sports. I think deep diving is better than surfing, okay? If you have an opportunity to do a deep dive, you're going to learn so much that you don't need to do that deep dive for the next 5 years, but you do a deep dive in an area, especially one that you're not familiar with, it's going to teach you a lot. A friend of mine is a technology strategist, pretty high level for Michelin Tire. They're a multinational. They have tire technology, is really sophisticated technology. He joined that company in his early 50s, and the first thing he did was spend 3 months making tires on the assembly line, okay, because he wanted to make tires for a while before he started looking at the technology there. And I think that's an interesting example. And I won't make any more jokes about MBAs, but B schools do not like to recruit students who have not had very deep industrial experience, and for a lot of good reasons. And so my own experience in working before getting my business degree was very important to me, and deep diving into all the things I did was very important to me. Traditionally, people have talked about going from academia to industry, you know, the one-way door. And more recently, I think there's more of a model that you can sort of go in the other direction. I work closely with Kripa Varanasi, who just got tenure. I do all the energy licensing at MIT. He's doing great. He just got tenure. He spun out 2 companies that I work with closely. They're both going to be really successful companies. And there's going to be more on the way. He worked as a researcher at General Electric in the labs after his PhD. He was a corporate researcher, and then he decided after a while to come to academia. That's an interesting example. I will finish with one. When I was asked to be on this panel, I was very happy, but then yesterday something happened that was sort of interesting given what I've just told all of you. My son is an undergraduate at MIT, or I think he's an undergraduate because he just finished his sophomore year, and he has an internship in Paradise, California. And he just called me yesterday and he said, "Dad, I'm not coming back to MIT next year." And I said, what? He said, yeah, I'm going to stay and work for this company that I have an internship with. And I said, well, are you going to come back? He said, yeah, I promise I'm going to come back, but I'm going to work with him for a year. And my first reaction was, oh my God. But now I realize, that's what I'm telling you folks. I'm really happy he's going to do that because he's going to learn what it's like to be in a cubicle for a year. And that's a valuable experience. And then I think when it comes back to MIT, I'm sure he will have a much broader perspective on what he wants to get out of the last 2 years of MIT. So deep diving instead of surfing. And that's the end of my remarks. And I'll be happy to partake in taking questions. Thank you.
So thank you to all panelists for sharing their perspective. I'm sure many of you have questions for them. Can I ask you to come to the front just so that everybody can hear your question and to direct it to the person? Does anybody want to start? Oh, you can yell it out if that makes it less intimidating. Ow, go for it.
As far as being in academia and consulting or partnering with industry, are there pitfalls that we should watch out for in your experience?
I think it's something one of the speakers said, and I'm not sure. I think it maybe came from something that other folks were saying. To really have a good sense when you go into it, what you are able to, for lack of a better word, own. So when you go into some sort of collaboration, and I'm probably most naive, I think, of our panelists, and you think it's just we're all going to think together out loud. If you have an investment in, particularly if you have an investment in what you're working on being shared publicly and being distributable, make sure you're really clear on the ability for that collaboration to go beyond the NDA that you might have just signed to start the conversation. So I think one of the pitfalls that's going to be most important to navigate are the limits to what you're going to be able to do with what you might have created or certainly taken part in co-creating. That for some folks can feel like a real violation if you feel like what you're working on is something that should really be part of the public record, part of a public conversation. And I think it's the biggest adjustment when you come from academia where you're used to being able to share ideas widely and think out loud, to have to even think twice about that. I find that one of the greatest challenges for me.
Well, I'll just mention a couple that have occurred to me when I've consulted over the years and still do. I mean, one is sort of sometimes companies want to tie you up in a certain area, and I've tried to avoid that. In other words, they might want to, I'll make this up, but let's say they said, we would like you to be exclusive consultant to us in the area of science. That probably would not be a good thing to sign. And I think that generally I try to get any exclusivity out. But sometimes people feel, the company feels it's very important to have an area, and then I think you want to try to define it as narrowly as possible. I think a second thing that I'd mention is stock and cash. In other words, making sure that you're getting the right amount of cash and the right amount of stock. And stock, one of the tricky things, though, is oftentimes people will give you options. But what happens, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize, is that a lot of option plans, if you're no longer working for the company, generally they have like a 3-month window. And it might cost you a lot of money to exercise those options, and those options might not, you might be spending that money and you might not make money, you might actually lose money. So it's actually very tricky sometimes when you get options. So those are always two things that I recommend for people to look out for. I mean, there's lots of others too, and I agree with what was said, but those are a couple things.
I can add 2 comments. Number one, if it's an MIT person who's facing that quandary, they should come and talk to our office because we give MIT people advice on that situation all the time. And secondly, if you're consulting, remember, it's a contract between you and the company. If you're doing sponsored research, it's a contract between MIT and the company. So there's a very, very different legal relationship.
successfully made some of these transitions and what some of the pitfalls were that you've seen?
There's certainly a lot of people I know who've tried to get an academic position from, say, an industrial position, and they just don't get the interviews or they don't get the jobs. But I think in general, academic jobs are so hard to get that whether it's because of their particular background, it's not really easy to say. So I also know quite a few people who've moved from a job here, for example, to an industrial job and not looked back. Sure, there's survivor bias in the group you're looking at here, but I think with any of these changes are a bit of a leap into the unknown. So you have to be prepared to realize if it's not working for you, do you have a backup plan? And that may be the way to deal with that kind of uncertainty, to say, all right, I'm going to try this, and let's say I get this job, and I'm going to try it for a certain length of time. If I don't like it, do I have a backup plan to get back into something else? So I think just looking ahead, I agree, you can't tell what you'll be interested in 20 years, and all of my job changes have been a random walk. It's what seemed good at the time. But I think it's worth having a plan B in case that particular random walk was a step backwards.
I can add to that I definitely think you're seeing survivor's bias here. I don't want to understate that, because I think particularly for academic jobs, how do I put this? They are increasingly rare. I don't honestly think anyone should think that they're making a choice between, I wonder if I want an academic job or an industry job. Genuinely speaking, I think it is often a matter of fortitude, luck, and your own capacity that makes it possible to have an academic job as an option at all. So I think MIT, there are a few institutions where it's quite exceptional that more of your peers than others make it into an academic position. But I feel like I always really struggle with saying this out loud, but I feel like I'm, as a maybe more recent graduate of a graduate school, I don't think we're doing our job if we don't say getting an academic post, a tenure track academic post at a Research One university is exceptional, even for folks coming from an exceptional institution. So preparing for that reality, in some case being able to keep at bay the intimidation of that reality, but really accepting that reality, I think is part of this conversation that I feel awkward saying out loud, but I think we should be talking about it more often. It's sort of like saying, hey, I'd like to be a professional musician and make my living as a professional musician. The odds are about the same. Or I'd like to go to California, Los Angeles, and become a paid full-time actor. The odds are about in the same range right now of landing a tenure track position as an R1 faculty member. So I say that not to scare you away from that, but to bring home the reality that those kinds of academic posts might be exceptional. That doesn't mean there's not a range of other academic posts both to consider and to see as really valuable if what you're driven to do is be part of this academic environment. That's why I'm really pushing you to reflect on what is it about this environment. And I feel like what you're doing today is a perfect example of having so much intelligence to bring to a campus environment that is not necessarily that tenure track position. But saying that, the folks I know who have struggled the most with leaving an academic post, often the folks I can think of are folks who left adjuncting and went into consulting, and their biggest challenge was accepting that they were really no longer their own boss. They really didn't get to define the problems that they wanted to solve. Problems were put in front of them. That can be somewhat jarring if you've spent your academic life being able to generate your own questions and pursue them. But I think what you said earlier, how important it is if you start out in industry, if you're interested in contributing to an academic setting, that you need to stay a part of the academic conversation by publishing and taking part in the scholarly communities that are the mainstays for most of our disciplines, that doesn't become optional. It really becomes a requirement if you want to move from industry back to academe or go between the two. And that's demanding. I think you described it spot on. It means working on weekends, working in the evening, and making that a part of your life, a part of the pursuit of industry work, of thinking, oh, how could this be part of that broader academic, or part of that scholarly conversation? That's the place where I've seen folks who want to leave academe leave industry, unable to move into an academic stream because they just don't have the profile, and they are competing with all of you. And you might just freshly have a PhD, have a few publications. For the social scientists in the room, what you're really being trained to do, you're being trained to be a writer more than anything else. Certainly a communicator, but at the end of the day, publishing your work is what you're charged to do. And so the minute the pace of that slows down and you start needing to put energy into other things as an industry-based researcher, it cuts into your ability to compete for those R1 positions. That by no means takes you out of the running for all of the other ways that you can contribute to an academic environment.
That's well said. I think those are well said. I agree with those.
Question for Professor Ross. Like you mentioned, it's very difficult to pursue publishable work in industry because of both the nature of the work and also the restrictions that the company places on you. So in making the jump from industry to academia, what are your reflections on what made you a competitive candidate for the job in academia?
So some of the things I did was I tried to publish as much as I could. So that took various forms. One thing is I wrote a review article which has a lot of citations. Now you can do that. You've just done a PhD or a postdoc in some topic. You know everything about that topic right now. So writing a review article is a good way of keeping things going. It doesn't get in the way of whatever you're doing in the company. I used the company's equipment to make samples which had no value to the company, so then they didn't mind if I published it. I should say I was not sneaky about this, so everything I published had to be approved by the company lawyers. So you can't go off and just pretend that that's not the case. But it was clear that the things I chose to work on were not going to be things that they would put up a fight about. I did also publish things that they would have put up a fight about if I'd published them immediately, but if I'd waited a couple of years, which I did, then the urgency of that was gone, the patent was written, everything was okay. I found it essential to work with other people. So this is the whole networking argument. You can't be doing all this by yourself. I had a colleague in Stanford. He had some equipment. I used that. He worked on it. We wrote some papers together. I used their libraries because we didn't have a library in the company. Those kind of things are still concerns because the company you work for may not have subscriptions to all of the journals you're used to. What are you going to do? So I even had a kind of research affiliate position at Stanford, which meant I could use their libraries. So you have to do a lot of different things. I also was involved in running MRS symposia and then running the whole, I was a conference organizer for the whole thing. So you just do everything you can. And it's not easy to think you've finished that activity. There's always more you can do. So of course you have to balance it with everything else. But I think the more of those activities you can do, the better, if you do want to keep your options open later.
I keep hearing that staying longer in academia will kind of reduce your chances to go to the industry, or there is like a rule that, okay, second, third, fourth postdoc will not really add that much to the academic career. So is there kind of golden time
don't think there is a cutoff. I think if you've done 5 or 6 postdocs, it looks like you don't know what you want to do. So I don't think I would recommend doing an excessive number of postdocs. Apart from that, there may be, early in your career it's easier to make these changes, but we have examples of people switching over later on, and even right at the end of the career you can almost like a retirement position become something like a professor of the practice and get back into an academic position at the end of a long and illustrious industrial performance. So I'm not sure if there's any real rules about it, but you just have to realize who will I compete with. You're looking at people who've done a shorter amount of postdoc and got more publications out of it. They may look more attractive. But you have to just think of all the things you're gaining from that industrial position that will be helpful. For example, the most useful things I learned in industry were not necessarily just how hard disks work, but also how to run a research group. Most of us coming straight into an academic position, you're learning that on the fly, which makes life a lot harder. So I don't think that the time in industry is valueless for an academic career, and neither should you, and neither should your resume.
Can I offer just one other tip on that, which is if you're thinking about particular institutions, say, R1 or baccalaureate, other kinds of institutions, look at who they just hired. And look across those institutions, and you're going to see, in most cases, a pattern. How many postdocs did they do? How many publications do they have? That's going to be the best gauge for you if you're in that band. If you're way off, you have another narrative you have to tell. You have to be able to explain why you look different, and that can be a challenge if most of the time you're doing that through a paper. So that's the best thing to do, and it can be so disciplinarily specific. My field doesn't have very many postdocs. So someone who's on a string of postdocs, by that point, they should probably have a book under contract. And so you're looking for those kinds of signals. I think what you said was a really good piece of advice, but that's strategically what you can do is look at institutions that interest you and see where folks are at.
Yeah, my experience on that question, in addition to what's been said, which I agree with, is that if you want to go into academia, you want to have enough postdoctoral experience depending on your department, which is also important, which was said, so that you have a good publication record. So I think that you probably want to have enough postdoctoral work so you have that publication record. And ideally, even maybe some experience at trying to raise money. One of the big issues when you're in academics, at least in a lot of departments, is grant writing and figuring out how to raise money. My experience with respect to companies, and again, it may depend whether it's a startup that you're personally involved in creating versus a large company where you'd fit in and learn a lot, and including some of the things that were said, I personally think you could use less experience. In other words, I certainly agree with you. You wouldn't want to do 6 postdocs. You wouldn't want to do 6 postdocs for either one. But I think I've certainly seen, and I'm going to give a huge generalization, plenty of people do, say, 2 postdocs for a professorship, and maybe 0 or 1 for an industrial position. I mean, just to give you some guidance on that question.
I don't know what it's like to be an American citizen, so I can't really make the comparison, but I haven't found it that much of a factor. I don't think it was, it's different, but is it more different than moving to another city in the same country? It's a little hard to say. So I just, I don't know if being from elsewhere makes a huge amount of difference, except that you don't know the systems here so well. You haven't been through the academic training here, so you don't necessarily know what they're talking about some of the time. We're used to, say, a 3-year PhD, at least when I did it, 3 years undergrad, 3 years PhD. When I was a postdoc, I was younger than most of the grad students. So that gave me some extra time to play with. So I think there are some pros and cons, but learning as much as you can about how the system works, how do you raise money, how do research groups actually work, the more of that you can do, the more helpful it will be for the applications that you might be putting in.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. At the time, there were a lot of things that were going through my mind. First, I think the answer to your question is I was living it at the moment and taking it as how it come. I didn't know, as I mentioned, ever what I wanted to do next. I'm still working on that. But and also I should say that it stretched me. And whenever you get stretched, I still remember I'm trying to learn, as a chemical engineer, I was trying to learn biology and surgery for the first time, and it was really hard. I would read articles in biological journals, and I'd understand 2%. I'd go in the lab and do stuff, and that was hard too because I didn't know what I was doing, and then I'd go back, but then I'd understand 4%, and so forth. So it was very frustrating, also for me. But I think when I look at it from hindsight, it stretched me so much that I was able to, like I say, know something about chemical engineering on the one hand and, say, medicine on the other, and that gave me a lot of ideas. But at the time, I felt both things. I felt some frustration, but I felt being able to overcome that frustration, and pushing through, I could see that what I felt like, that what I was doing, I felt it was really important. And that just meant more to me than anything else, the fact that I felt it was important and could change and maybe save lives.
Hi, thank you for your remarks. I have concrete question, let's say you're entering your last year. What would you say people have to or should really be focusing on doing in terms of making this decision or considering or weighing the different options? You all mentioned talking to lots of different people and so on, but I wonder if there's, if you kind of think about, you have 9 months or 12 months, however long, what must you absolutely do to try to move along in this decision?
I'll start just to help a little bit, but my answer is only a very small microcosm of it, so I'll let other people, but I certainly thought of one thing, and that is if you're thinking at all about wanting to go into academia, make sure you write your papers up. I think that's a really important thing. Sometimes I watch people finish their degree and haven't written their papers up, but if you're ever thinking about it, even have the faintest inkling of going into academia, one thing I'd make sure I do in those last 9 months is finish your projects and write your papers up. There's lots of other things that are very, very important, and I agree with talking to people because you really do want to understand what jobs are like, and that's a very, very hard thing to do. But certainly if anybody has any idea about academia, you'd write your papers up. You'd also want to, again, if you're looking for a postdoc, it's better not to wait till the last minute. It's better to actually start 9, 12 months in advance looking at labs that you might want a postdoc in and write to them, maybe write fellowships and things like that. But like I say, that's hardly a complete answer, and I should let other people add to it.
I think for the, if you're thinking about an industrial position, see if you can find someone there who's maybe done that job for a few years and talk to them. Maybe you can go visit for a day. You have to learn as much as you can, because I think one of the problems is we don't know what it's like at all. You can listen to me talk about it, but unless you actually go there and do it, you just have no idea what a professional research job is like. Even, I think a postdoc we can more or less imagine because we all work with postdocs and you know what they do, and they're like more mature versions of grad students, hopefully. But industrial research, well, one hopes, right? Industrial research is often a very different, it's just a different mental outlook, a different set of concerns. One of the most shocking things to me was I had to fill in a time card because you only get 10 days vacation per year. And that was the hardest thing because, of course, we're used to disappearing and then asking permission from our advisors afterwards. But you can't do that sort of thing anymore. So really, if you've got friends who've done this, if you can find anyone, go and learn as much as you can, even if it's not the company you end up applying to. Any knowledge like that is better than nothing.
Yeah, I would take that one step further. I think write your papers, but go and talk to some companies seriously about working for them. I mean, this is an option that you're considering, and it's not dishonest for you to go to a company and say, I'm really interested in deep diving with you about this job opportunity. You're considering two options, and you should consider them in real depth, because you can't really buy something until you've sold yourself, right? So it sounds from the way you've presented this question that you're seriously considering both paths, and you should interview for jobs, and at the same time finish off your degree properly, and find the time to do both, so you really know concretely what your choices are.
One other thought to add to that. If you're thinking about an academic direction, a year before you're done, I wouldn't do it before that. Maybe 8 months out. Subscribe to Chronicle of Higher Education's alerts so that you're reading what do job posts look like, what kinds of things did they ask for, where are they coming from. That should be something that you're starting to digest now, a year out, so that you're not surprised by what kinds of things they're asking for. Practically speaking, literally the year before an academic year, before you're done, you're thinking about jobs that are coming out in July, August, September for my field. And every field's a little bit different, but what you want to find out is what is their timeline for doing interviews? Where do they have those interviews? For academic jobs, it becomes really, really important to get the timing right. So by July, kind of setting up your files so you can imagine that you're going to have at the ready a CV and publications list and some basics in place, and every job post is going to ask for different collections of those things. One axiom, it's sort of like buying a new car. Once you get your degree, your valuation drops dramatically in some ways because you're now competing with someone all but dissertation who might also be on the job market in some fields, who has all of the potential but doesn't have to prove anything. Once you graduate, you have to prove much more than someone who has not. This is very much the case in social sciences because departments like to, I'm going to throw in all sorts of economic terms, buy cheap. There's nothing cheaper than buying someone who hasn't finished their PhD but has a lot of potential through maybe 1 or 2 or 3 really well-placed publications, has some visibility at conferences. So when you're thinking about your competition for academic posts, you really want to think about, if you're all but dissertation, there are a different set of expectations on you as a candidate, and that in many cases puts you at an advantage. If you're someone who's about to finish, for humanities, social sciences, it's imperative that you've published something because you're competing with people who have something in the pipeline and may have several other pieces that they would be able to present. And you're also competing with all the folks who didn't get jobs in the last 2 to 3 years, potentially, who have book contracts, have book manuscripts. So having that in mind and knowing where do you stand in that calculus, I never advise a student in the social sciences or humanities to graduate in the winter. Like, drag it out. There is nothing to be gained by leaving graduate school because you just want to be done with it. No. Stay here until it looks absurd that you're still here. Because this is the place that gives you some shelter, some protection, and some collegiality that's going to help you figure out where do you want to go next. And being in this place while you're checking things out for academic posts, I don't think any of this necessarily applies to into industrial positions. This is the best place for you to figure out what is it about this place that you really want to hold on to. What's going to give you the capacity to do that so that you don't jump out too soon. And I'm always surprised by the number of grad students I meet who will say, well, I just got it done because I was tired of being a grad student. Then you definitely should not go into an academic career. Because once you're done, I remember vividly finishing my dissertation, and as within the first year when I was thinking about, okay, now I've got to turn around and work on my book, I turned to my partner and I said, it's just going to be another 5 years. And I mean, we both laughed out loud because I had just finished saying that about my dissertation. So being aware that, that's part of that path, so that when you're looking at jobs, you've really got your eyes wide open to that reality. The other place to look is Academic Wiki. I don't know how many of you are looking at that, but I think there are so many different places now where you can get some backstory on where you're applying and what posts are out there. They're not just academic posts, might be postdocs, but also non-academic track research positions in private and public sector.
Can I add just briefly, I think this is where humanities and science are very different, because all of you who are in science or engineering, I don't think you stand much of a chance getting an academic job without having that PhD done. Sure. So this may be a point where the two cultures are quite different. So I think with as an advisor of students, I would encourage them to get done and get on with it, and do a postdoc and be looking for those academic jobs while you're a postdoc, I think is more likely to be successful.
So Professor Langer actually talked about how when he got some interviews from the industry, he was thinking about what he doesn't like to do, and that's how he ruled out some options. That certainly has been a guiding principle in my whole life, and maybe many here, when you make choices, you think about the options that you dislike the least, or something like that. So my question, pretty much for everyone, is that, or whoever wants to answer that, is that what are the things that you don't like right now about the path that you have chosen? It's either industry, academia, and startups.
I don't think we've got time to answer that question.
It's a great question.
Well, whilst my co-panelists are thinking about how to answer your question, I just want to make a remark on your comment of choosing I'm paraphrasing a bit, choosing the path that you like. There's a few things you dislike about, something like that. I didn't hear this from my co-panelists. I think if you are inquisitive and you're exploring, you come across things that you immediately say to yourself, this is really what I want to do next. And so I would encourage you to believe that's always been my experience. I've had several pretty dramatic career changes, and sometimes they were unpredictable. I was always sort of on the lookout, and many times I would bark up some bad alleys, but then all of a sudden I'd open a door and I'd go, this is it, and I know that this is what I want to do next. So I just wanted to put more of an optimistic spin on that, because that's just certainly been my experience.
So the question is what we don't like about our path, or about our job?
It's basically the same. Basically the bottom line is, so you have chosen a specific path. That's industry, startups, and you have changed in between. So what are the things that you do not like right now about the path that you have chosen?
Yeah.
Well, is it just a perfect paradise kind of place that you want to always do?
Yeah, sure. So I guess for me, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I don't think I'd change very much. I might like to be on a few less committees, but I love my job. I don't think of it as a job. I think it was like what you said before. Like people talk to me about retiring and stuff. I think, like, why would I do that? To me, this is like fun. I love doing it. So I wouldn't change anything. The only thing, and it's funny, I've never taken a sabbatical. A lot of people do. I just love doing what I do. So I don't think I'd change anything, but the committee thing, that sometimes I feel like, you're on so many committees in academia. Maybe you are in industry too, but if there's one thing I'd change, it might be that.
I have such survivor's guilt actually, because I love what I do. I love being a faculty member. I love teaching. I love being with students. I love what I learn from them. And I love being in an industry setting that gives me more latitude to be publicly engaged. And I think the thing that I'm probably, again, I feel incredibly fortunate. I'm in a place that does allow me a lot of latitude for engaging the public. In fact, that's part of what I'm expected to do at Microsoft Research. I think that's exceptional. So I can imagine when I'm thinking about similar research positions on the more company side, I can imagine I would be someone who would really feel constrained by being given direction on what I should work on, because I love what I do in academic settings, because I don't have to have anyone tell me what I think I should work on. So I can't imagine. I feel incredibly lucky right now.
I think I'd just say that when the reason I switched into an academic job was because I wanted to have more choice about what I did, rather than solving problems that somebody else gave me to solve. Not that I didn't enjoy solving them, but it was nice to be able to think that you could go further with something or go off in a promising looking direction. So there are huge numbers of positives about this kind of job. I think, as you heard, the biggest problem is we have to do a lot of admin, we have to write a lot of proposals, we have to do a lot of paperwork types of things, but it's worth it. I mean, I think we're all here because we feel that the positives far outweigh the negatives. So again, it's not a maybe representative sample, but I think the bad parts are not. They may be. We may have some unpleasant things we have to do, but they're not showstoppers.
This has to be our last question. So.
I guess several MIT professors at this point have told me they see their career as a random walk, which I think is a little terrifying given my type A planner type of personality. So I'm wondering, was your head always up looking for the next opportunity, and when you found what you liked, you went for it, or was it like you focused on what you were doing, and then when you felt ready for a change, you looked around?
I would be in the latter of your two categories, but I don't think it's necessary to, I mean, a random walk worked for me, but if you're a type A personality, you want to be in control of everything at all times, well, you just make the decision that you're ready for a move and you look around and you decide where you want to go. I think it's a question of whether you sit there and wait for opportunities to come or whether you really go out and pursue them. And if you know what you want, by all means, you should go and pursue it. I think part of the random walkness is that, in my case, I liked what I was doing anyway, so it wasn't that I was desperate to get out of any particular thing, that I had to immediately go and search for the next job. So I don't see any downside with being a type A personality. You'll certainly get your papers written up, right? So that's a good start.
Well, since this is MIT, I'll give a quantitative response to your question. I think 80% of the time, you should be getting out of bed in the morning with your head down and focusing on the job you got to do and not worry about the future of the universe or of yourself. And 20% of the time, you step back and you reflect, or maybe 90-10. So, but have that, you can't be looking all the time. And once in a while, you step back and take a really hard look at where you are. But that's periodically and for a small period of time, and then you go dive back into it. That would be my advice.
Well, I probably went over some sense of what I was thinking before. So my feeling is, to me, it's a random walk, or at least for me, but it was a random walk in a certain direction where I kept looking for how could I make an impact, and I kept using that as a guide. But it certainly, as you could see from what I said, I mean, I didn't know what the heck I was doing, but I kept having that as a guide, and eventually, I found my way here.
I'm a planner. I like planning a lot, and I think the hardest thing about an academic position, or really any position where you're trying to find what excites you the most, is that there's only so much you can control. And being able to think about you're going to create your greatest opportunities, and you'll have the most options based on what you accomplish, right? And what you have to show for where you're at. So I love the idea of, if you're spending 80 to 90% of the time doing what you've planned to do and getting it done, you've just created the options that are going to give you a lot more latitude to plan. Being able, for myself, if I spend too much time thinking about what else I'd like to do or how else I might do it, I usually distract myself from getting done the list of to-dos that I have in front of me. And doing those first is a really good way to give yourself some options so that you can plan.
So we want to thank our panelists for giving us very valuable time. So this panel is brought to you by the Academics, Careers and Research and Careers Subchair in GSC. If you have any questions, could you please email the address that is on the board?